Somewhere between 5 and 10% of people alive today report having little to no inner voice at all, no internal narration, no running commentary, nothing at all going on in words. And even among people who do have one, research suggests it's only actually present in roughly a quarter of their waking moments. Which means the voice that feels like the most obviously universal human experience isn't universal, and isn't even constant for most of the people who have it. So here's the actual question worth sitting with carefully, and it's stranger than it first sounds. If that voice isn't constant and isn't universal, what exactly is it? Where does it come from? Is it doing something specific for the people who have it? And is it really you in the way it feels like it is? Or something closer to a very convincing roommate who moved in before you were old enough to object? Let's start with where the voice actually comes from, because the answer isn't mystical. It's developmental, and it's been studied for close to a century. The Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky proposed one of the most influential theories on this back in the 1930s, and much of it still holds up. Young children don't start out with a silent inner voice at all. They start out talking to themselves out loud. Watch almost any toddler playing alone, stacking blocks, or moving toy cars around, and you'll hear a running narration put this here. Now this one goes there spoken directly out loud, to no one. Vygotsky called this private speech, and his theory was that it doesn't disappear as children grow older. It goes underground. Somewhere around age 7, give or take, that out loud narration gradually becomes quieter, more fragmented, and eventually internal, the same self-directed commentary. Just no longer audible to anyone but the child producing it. Later researchers have refined and sometimes meaningfully challenged parts of Vygotsky's original timeline. But the core idea that inner speech develops out of earlier, out loud, socially directed speech, rather than appearing fully formed on its own, has held up remarkably well across decades of follow-up research. Here's the detail that should genuinely change how you think about your own inner voice. And it's not a small point. It doesn't emerge from nothing. It's built directly out of language you were taught by other people, using grammar and vocabulary, and even tone that came from the specific adults who talked to you as a small child. Before you could generate a single internal thought in words, someone else had to hand you those words first, usually a parent or caregiver, repeating instructions, narrating your own actions back to you, correcting you, encouraging you. Vygotsky's theory suggests your inner voice is, quite literally, an internalized version of that external speech, not a metaphorical echo of your upbringing. An actual, functional descendant of it, running on hardware your own brain's language centers that had to be built by repeated exposure to other people talking before it could ever start talking to you. That reframes the question in an uncomfortable way worth actually sitting with. If the voice narrating your thoughts right now runs on vocabulary, syntax, and habitual phrasing you absorbed entirely from other people, at an age before you had any say in the matter, how much of that voice is actually a neutral, original you, and how much of it is just early childhood language exposure, still running the show decades later? It gets stranger once you look at what the inner voice actually does once it's up and running, because it isn't just narration. Neuroscience research using brain imaging has found that inner speech activates many of the same regions involved in actually speaking out loud Broca's area, and related language production regions light up whether you're talking to another person or silently talking to yourself. Your brain, in a very real sense, doesn't fully distinguish between saying it and thinking it in words. Which means every time that inner voice weighs in on a decision, criticizes something you did, or rehearses an argument you're planning to have, it's using the exact same neural machinery your brain uses to actually speak to another person, as if some small part of your mind is always mid-conversation, even when no one else is in the room. There's an even stranger demonstration of this from a completely different line of research, and it might be the single best piece of evidence that your inner narrator isn't a neutral reporter of the truth. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, neuroscientists Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga studied patients who'd had the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, surgically severed as a treatment for severe epilepsy. This let researchers show information to only one hemisphere at a time. In one now famous version of the experiment, researchers flashed the image of a chicken claw to a patient's left hemisphere and a snowy winter scene to the right hemisphere, then asked the patient to point at a related picture from a set of options using each hand separately. The patient's right hand, controlled by the language dominant left hemisphere, correctly pointed to a chicken. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, correctly pointed to a snow shovel. But here's the part that matters. When Gazzaniga asked the patient to explain, out loud, why he'd chosen the shovel, the left hemisphere, the verbal, narrating half of the brain, the half responsible for that inner voice, had no access to the snow scene at all. It hadn't seen it. And instead of saying, "I don't know," it instantly invented a plausible-sounding explanation. The shovel is for cleaning out the chicken shed. Confident, coherent, delivered without hesitation, and completely made up. Gazzaniga called this language-generating region the interpreter. And later research suggests this isn't some rare split brain quirk. It's something your narrating inner voice appears to do constantly, in ordinary brains, every day, constructing a confident, coherent story to explain your own behavior and feelings, whether or not it actually has access to the real reasons behind them. Now, the part that should really unsettle the assumption that this voice is simply you, thinking neutrally, with no agenda of its own. Psychologist Russell Hurlburt at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, has spent decades using a method called descriptive experience sampling, where participants carry a small device that beeps at random intervals throughout the day, and they report exactly what was happening in their mind the instant before the beep. Across many thousands of these randomly sampled moments, gathered over decades of ongoing research, Hurlburt's findings have found that inner speech, that verbal, word-based narration, was only present in roughly 26% of the moments sampled. Not close to constant, roughly a quarter of the time. The rest of the time, people's minds were doing something else entirely, feeling an emotion without narrating it, picturing something visually, or simply experiencing a sensation with no verbal commentary attached to it at all. The voice you assume is always running in the background, judging and narrating everything, is actually silent more often than it's speaking. You just don't notice the silence the same way you notice the talking. Here's a strange detail that undercuts the neutral narrator idea even further. The actual grammar your inner voice uses changes what it does to you. A 2014 study by Sanda Dolkos and Dolores Alberic found that people who addressed themselves internally using you, as in, "you can figure this out," performed better on tasks and reported stronger follow-through on their own intentions than people who addressed themselves using I. Later research on cyclists, led by James Hardy in 2019, found the same basic pattern in physical endurance. Athletes who used second-person self-talk during a timed cycling trial outperformed the exact same athletes using first-person self-talk on a separate attempt. Nobody fully agrees on why yet. One leading explanation is that you create a small, useful psychological distance, making the voice feel more like encouragement from someone else than pressure from yourself, which is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. The same mind, talking to itself, performs measurably differently depending on which pronoun it happens to use, as if part of the effect only works when the voice feels a little less like you, and a little more like someone else entirely. And then there's the roughly 5 to 10% of people for whom that voice barely shows up at all, if ever. In 2024, researchers Johan Nedergaard and Gary Lupion formally studied this and gave it a name, anendophasia literally, without inner speech. They compared people who reported near constant inner narration against people who reported almost none at all, and ran both groups through a battery of memory and language tasks. The low inner speech group performed measurably worse on certain verbal working memory tasks and rhyme judgments, small but real, statistically meaningful differences, suggesting the inner voice isn't just decorative background noise, it's doing at least some functional cognitive work for the people who actually have it. But, and this matters, people without that inner narration aren't thinking in a void. They report thinking in images, abstract impressions, spatial layouts, or wordless just knowing. Their minds work fine. They just don't hear themselves doing it. Which brings up the question these two groups together make almost impossible to honestly avoid. If some people run entire full lives planning, deciding, remembering, feeling without any internal verbal narrator at all, then whatever that narrator does for the rest of us clearly isn't reasoning itself. Reasoning happens either way. The voice is something layered on top of thought, not the mechanism of thought itself. It's more like a translator or a press secretary, converting whatever is actually happening underneath into a tidy verbal package you can consciously inspect, remember, and repeat to yourself later useful, but not the same thing as the process it's reporting on. There's one more piece of evidence worth including, because it directly undercuts the idea that your inner voice is some fixed, essential you. People who are genuinely bilingual, when questioned about their inner speech, frequently report that it shifts the language their inner voice uses, depends on context, mood, who they were just speaking with, or even what topic they're thinking about. If your inner voice were truly a fixed essential core of your identity, you'd expect it to stay constant no matter what language you happen to be operating in day to day. Instead, for a meaningful number of people, it switches sometimes without them even noticing the switch happened. Which is a strange thing to discover about a voice you've spent your whole life assuming was the single unchanging center of who you are. The clearest, most vivid version of this same point comes from deaf people who grew up using sign language as their first and primary language. Many describe something researchers call inner signing, not a silent voice made of sound at all, but an internal experience of seeing or even physically forming asal signs, sometimes with subtle sensations in their hands. The same way a hearing person's lips sometimes twitch faintly while reading intently. Brain imaging studies have found that inner signing activates language processing regions strikingly similar to the ones activated by spoken inner speech in hearing people the same general neural neighborhood, running on a completely different sensory format. This matters because it shows, about as directly as evidence can, that the specific form your inner voice takes, sound, sign, image, or some blend, isn't hardwired into being human at all. It's built entirely out of whatever language you actually grew up learning, in whatever modality that language happened to use. So what does all of this actually add up to? Not that your inner voice is fake or meaningless or something to distrust. It's doing real cognitive work, helping with memory, self-regulation, planning, rehearsal, but it's not some pure, untouched core of selfhood that exists independently of everything around you. It was built, piece by piece, out of language other people gave you before you had any say in the matter. It runs on the same machinery your brain uses to talk to other humans. It confabulates confident explanations for things it didn't actually witness, the same way Gazzaniga's split brain patients did. It isn't even switched on most of the time. And for a meaningful share of people, it barely runs at all, with no apparent cost to their ability to think, decide, or be a complete person. None of this means you should start distrusting every thought that voice produces, or treat your own mind as some unreliable stranger. Most of what it tells you is useful, accurate enough, and worth listening to. But it's worth holding a little more lightly than most people do, less like the unquestionable voice of your true self reporting objective facts about who you are and why you did what you did, and more like a narrator doing its best with incomplete information, the same way any narrator would. The voice in your head isn't an imposter, exactly. But it's less like a narrator reporting on you from some neutral outside position, and more like one more thing you built out of childhood, out of language, out of every person who ever talked to you before you could talk back. Do you actually hear a voice in your head as you read this, constantly narrating every single thought as it happens? Or has your mind mostly been doing something else entirely this whole time without you ever really noticing? Let me know honestly what you think in the comments. See you in the very next one.